The morning fog at Heathrow rolled across the tarmac like cigarette smoke in a dive bar, thick gray and reluctant to clear. Captain Alexander Alex Morgan moved through Terminal 3 with quiet efficiency, olive drab duffel slung over one shoulder, posture straight but unassuming. Her dark hair was pulled back in a regulation bun. The khaki jacket she wore was more functional than fashionable. Nothing about her screamed for attention. That was intentional. Only the small purple heart pinned to her lapel offered any hint that the woman passing through the terminal was anything more than another traveler. Few noticed it, even fewer understood what it meant, that this woman had bled for her country while still completing her mission. Alex paused near the massive windows overlooking the runway, her eyes tracking a Boeing 777 as it taxied toward the terminal. She didn't just see the aircraft. She read it. The slight vibration in the left engine nacelle, the way condensation formed differently across the port wing, the almost imperceptible delay between thrust reverser deployment on engine 1 versus engine 2. Most passengers saw transportation. Alex Morgan saw complex systems speaking a language of metal and hydraulics she'd learned to interpret over 12 years in the United States Air Force. Year 2017, she whispered to herself, and a civilian aircraft taking off from London would become a battlefield at 36,000 feet over the Atlantic Ocean. The boarding pass in her hand said, Gate 42, Seat 29E, economy as usual. She'd never expected anything else. Military service taught you to make do with what you had, not wish for what you didn't. The gate area was already crowded when she arrived. Businessmen in expensive suits, families corralling overtired children, college students with backpacks and noise-canceling headphones. Alex found a vacant seat near a support column and settled in, fishing a worn paperback from her bag, A History of the Persian Gulf War. The memories hit without warning. Baghdad, Green Zone, November 2009. The C-130 Hercules sat on the tarmac, wounded and vulnerable. Hydraulic fluid pooled beneath the right wing, still dripping from where shrapnel had torn through the lines during the last supply run. Insurgent mortar fire walked closer to the airfield with each passing minute. Morgan, Sergeant Frank Miller shouted over the distant explosions, "We've got 30 minutes to patch this bird, or we're leaving 73 Rangers stranded at the Foe B." Miller, pushing 60 with steel gray hair and desert-weathered skin, had been maintaining aircraft since Desert Storm. His hands moved with practiced precision as he disconnected the damaged hydraulic lines. "I need a pressure bypass on the auxiliary circuit," Alex called back, her voice steady despite the chaos. "If we can reroute through the secondary manifold." The whistle of incoming mortar fire cut her off. Miller's head snapped up. "Down!" Alex dropped flat as the explosion rocked the tarmac 50 yards away. She scrambled to her feet as Miller tossed her the M4 carbine they'd brought for protection. "Cover us," he ordered, nodding toward the three other maintenance crew working frantically on the opposite wing. "I'll finish the bypass." The weight of the rifle felt familiar in her hands. Alex took position, scanning the perimeter for threats through the iron sights. When movement flickered near the edge of the airfield, she fired 3 precise shots. A cry confirmed her aim was true. 30 seconds, Miller called from beneath the wing. The second mortar round hit closer. Shrapnel whistled through the air. Alex felt the hot punch of metal through her left shoulder, but didn't drop her position. Blood soaked through her uniform as she maintained her protective stance. "Morgan, you're hit," one of the crew shouted. "Finish the damn bird," she replied through gritted teeth, firing again at shadows moving along the perimeter fence. 20 minutes later, the C-130 lifted off with its critical supplies, leaving 4 maintenance crew and 1 bleeding technical sergeant watching from the tarmac. Only then did Alex allow the medics to reach her. As they loaded her onto a stretcher, Miller leaned down. His weathered face, lined with decades of service, broke into a rare smile. "When the Eagle calls Morgan," he said, "it doesn't matter who you are. What matters is whether you answer." Final boarding call for British Airways Flight 283 to New York Kennedy. The announcement jarred Alex back to the present. She shouldered her duffel and joined the line, shuffling toward the jet bridge. As she handed her boarding pass to the gate agent, the scanner emitted an unexpected beep. The agent looked at her screen, then up at Alex with a practiced smile. "It seems you've been upgraded, Captain Morgan. First class seat 3A. Alex blinked, genuinely surprised. "There must be some mistake." "No mistake, ma'am. The agent nodded toward the purple heart on Alex's lapel. The captain noticed your decoration. He's a former military pilot himself. Please enjoy the upgrade. Alex accepted the new boarding pass with a quiet, thank you, uncertain how to respond to the unexpected recognition. Military courtesy was ingrained, but so was the habit of avoiding special attention. First class smelled different, leather and something faintly citrus. The cabin crew welcomed her with genuine warmth, gesturing toward her seat by the window. Alex stowed her duffel in the overhead bin and settled in, still feeling strangely out of place among the luxury. Across the aisle, two men in their early 50s had noticed her arrival. They weren't subtle about their assessment. Late 50s with broad shoulders, military haircuts grown out just enough to suggest they were off-duty rather than discharged. She caught the glint of an Annapolis class ring on one man's finger as he swirled his pre-departure scotch. James Reeves? The older man introduced himself without being asked, leaning across the aisle. His tailored suit and Rolex Submariner screamed affluence, but his posture and the way his eyes constantly swept the cabin betrayed his military background. Commander Navy SEALs retired. This is Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Harris. Harris, younger by perhaps 5 years, nodded without warmth. His expensive haircut and manicured nails suggested a man who'd moved past his military roots into a lucrative civilian position. But something in his manner, a studied imitation of Reeves' confidence, suggested he still orbited his senior officer. Alexandra Morgan, she replied simply, Captain Air Force. Air Force, Reeves repeated, exchanging a glance with Harris. What division pilot? Aircraft maintenance and combat systems repair. Fixed and rotary wing. Something changed in Reeves' expression, a subtle tightening around the eyes, a reassessment. Ah, support staff. The words carried a dismissal so familiar Alex could have recited it from memory. She'd heard variations of it throughout her career, the unspoken hierarchy that placed technical specialists and maintenance crews below the glamour positions, regardless of skill or contribution. What brings you to first class? Harris asked, his tone suggesting she'd wandered in by mistake. Not exactly standard accommodations for ground crew. Alex turned a page in her book without looking up. Apparently the captain appreciated my Purple Heart. Combat decoration for a mechanic. Harris's voice carried poorly disguised skepticism. Don't they usually give those to people actually in combat? I wouldn't know, Alex replied evenly. I was too busy trying to stop bleeding from shrapnel while covering my maintenance team during a mortar attack. Perhaps they give them out differently in the Navy. Reeves' expression hardened. I earned my decorations in Desert Storm, Captain. When men like me were securing Baghdad support teams were safely behind the lines. I'm sure the Rangers who needed that C-130 fixed under fire would have preferred your combat expertise over my maintenance skills. Alex said, her voice level, despite the heat rising in her chest. Unfortunately, they had to settle for a woman who could stop hydraulic systems from bleeding out while taking incoming. The conversation might have ended there with mutual discomfort and silent recognition of different service experiences. But Harris, perhaps seeking approval from his mentor, pushed further. Excuse me, he said, raising a finger to summon a passing flight attendant. A Hispanic woman in her early 40s with Monsieur Rodriguez on her name tag approached with a professional smile. There seems to be some confusion with the seating arrangements. Rodriguez glanced between Harris and Alex, her smile never wavering, though something flickered behind her eyes. Is there a problem, sir? First class is usually reserved for paying customers, Harris said, gesturing vaguely toward Alex, or people with actual rank. I'm not sure a support technician qualifies. The flight attendant's smile faltered. She crouched beside Alex's seat, voice lowered and apologetic. Ma'am, I'm very sorry, but it seems there may have been an error with your seating assignment. I need to ask you to return to your original seat. Alex closed her book without sound, marking her place with the boarding pass. She met Rodriguez's eyes, finding no malice there, just uncomfortable duty, and nodded once. Of course. She stood and stepped into the aisle. Reeves and Harris watched her with satisfied expressions as she collected her duffel from the overhead bin. Some people can't tell the difference between support staff and actual leadership, Reeves stage whispered as she passed. Harris chuckled into his drink. Give them a uniform and they think they belong anywhere. Whispers spread through first class like ripples. Alex said nothing. She walked to row 29, where economy pressed passengers together like sardines. Her original seat was narrower, the overhead bins stuffed full. She wedged her duffel beneath the seat and settled back. Around her fellow passengers avoided eye contact. They'd seen her escorted back, caught enough whispered conversation to piece together a familiar narrative. Alex folded her hands in her lap and fixed her gaze out the tiny window. Her face betrayed nothing but something settled in her chest like a stone. She'd carried humiliation before, worn it like extra gear during years spent proving herself in spaces that hadn't been designed for her. As the aircraft pushed back from the gate, that weight pressed down. The wrong lingered behind her like turbulence, invisible but impossible to ignore. The plane climbed through the cloud layers, engines settling into the steady thrum that would carry them across the Atlantic. From her window seat, Alex watched the English countryside shrink until it looked like a child's model railroad. Around her, the cabin settled into long-haul rhythms. Attendants wheeled drink carts down aisles. Laptops opened toward reading lights. Conversations died to murmurs. The universal process of strangers learning to coexist in a metal tube for 8 hours. Nobody made eye contact with her. The passengers nearby had witnessed her walk of shame, heard enough commentary to construct their own version of events. In a cabin full of chatter, Alex Morgan had become effectively invisible. She didn't mind invisibility. For years, she'd worked in shadows beside cockpits instead of inside them. The mechanic nobody noticed until an engine screamed or hydraulics bled out. Still, humiliation sat in her chest like undigested food. She opened her book again, but her eyes kept drifting toward the front of the aircraft. During boarding, the captain had stood briefly in the galley doorway. Most people had nodded politely and moved on, but Alex's trained eye had caught details others missed. The wings on his uniform were regulation pilot's wings, but just above them, a small pin gleamed gold. Not the expected commercial airline insignia, but something she recognized immediately, a Navy SEAL trident. Beside it, almost imperceptible, hung a miniature Navy cross. More intriguing was the custom watch on his wrist. Not ostentatious like Reeves' Rolex, but a sturdy aviator's chronograph with a distinctive emblem engraved on its face. A desert falcon clutching lightning bolts, the insignia of the Desert Talons, an elite F-18 squadron that had flown critical missions during Operation Desert Storm. Her father's squadron. Captain Richard Morgan had piloted an F-18 Hornet during the Gulf War, one of the first waves into Baghdad. Alex had been only 5 when he died, shot down during a mission that military records described only as classified air support. She'd grown up with her mother's stories, worn his aviator sunglasses around her neck through high school, and ultimately followed a parallel path into the Air Force. Not as a pilot, her eyesight wasn't quite good enough, but as the next best thing, the person who kept the aircraft flying. Could this airline captain have known her father? The timeline fit. The connection to the Desert Talons was unmistakable. But commercial flights carried thousands of military veterans each day. Coincidences happened, and even if there was a connection, what difference did it make now? From the front, laughter drifted back like smoke. Reeves and Harris were well into their second-round voices, carrying easily over the white noise. Problem with the modern military, Reeves was saying, gesturing with his glass, is too many paper soldiers. Whole armies full of them now. Desk jobs, mechanics, support staff. None of them belong in the real fight. Harris nodded sagely. Bet that one back in economy couldn't even field strip a rifle. Probably calls roadside assistance when her car won't start. Scattered chuckles rippled through nearby seats. Alex stared at cloud formations building on the horizon, her face unchanged. She'd learned that some conversations weren't worth joining, especially when the speakers had already decided what they knew about you. The plane hit turbulence. Nothing serious, just enough to rattle ice and make passengers glance around nervously. Alex felt it differently. Not as random buffeting, but as communication from the machine itself. The slight hesitation in the left engine's rhythm, the way the wing flexed to absorb stress. She'd spent too many years listening to aircraft to miss the signs when they started talking. And this one was beginning to whisper things that made her pay attention in ways the other passengers weren't. An hour into the flight, cruising altitude brought false calm. The seatbelt sign had clicked off. Cabin lights dimmed for the long stretch over dark water. Passengers dozed with blankets. Screens flickered with movies. Attendants moved with practiced rhythm. Alex kept her eyes closed but never really slept on flights. Old habit from too many military transports where sleep meant missing the warning rattle or pitch change that came before something failed. She listened with more than her ears. The first sign was smell a faint acrid tang in the recirculated air buried beneath coffee and cleaning solutions. To most passengers, it was just airplane smell. To Alex, it was unmistakable. Overheated wiring, insulation cooking under electrical strain. Then came the sound of barely perceptible cough in the left engine, masked by steady drone. But she'd spent years learning to hear individual voices in that chorus, and one was starting to stutter. She sat forward, gaze narrowing on the wing. The flex pattern looked normal. The exhaust trail wasn't. A subtle vibration rippled through the fuselage, not turbulence, but mechanical stress. Overhead bins rattled softly. A baby started crying 3 rows back. Then the lights flickered not once, but twice long enough for people to look up from entertainment screens with unease. Alex unfastened her seatbelt and stood stretching casually while her eyes assessed the cabin. The flight attendants were moving with slightly increased urgency, their practiced smiles a bit too tight around the edges. In the galley, she caught a glimpse of Rodriguez, speaking into a phone, her expression concerned. Returning to her seat, Alex leaned toward the window. The left engine housing was visibly vibrating now, a subtle shimmy that wouldn't alarm most passengers, but sent clear warning signals to her trained eye. Near the wing root, a barely perceptible mist suggested the beginning of a fuel line leak. Not catastrophic yet, but concerning. Multiple systems showing stress simultaneously usually indicated a cascading failure rather than isolated issues. The intercom crackled, but before the captain could speak, thin gray smoke began seeping from ventilation grills above first class. Just wisps, but enough to carry that bitter electrical smell throughout the forward cabin. The change was immediate. Heads snapped toward the ceiling. Conversations died. Someone said, "Is that smoke?" in a voice pitched higher than normal. Flight attendants materialized with movements just too quick to be casual. "Please remain calm and seated," Rodriguez announced, but her smile looked painted on. "We're investigating a minor technical issue." Alex's pulse slowed instead of speeding up. Combat training had drilled that response. When everyone else panicked, you slowed down, took inventory. She breathed carefully. Smoke from electronics, definitely, but no raw fuel, no combustion. Smell not an explosion, not fire in the cabin, but something electrical was cooking itself to death. A deep shudder ran through the airframe, hard enough to slosh drinks and rattle overhead compartments. One popped open above row 15, spilling a laptop bag before snapping shut. People gasped. Someone screamed, and the baby's crying turned into wailing. In first class, Reeves and Harris were on their feet, earlier confidence evaporating. "What the hell's happening?" Reeves demanded, grabbing a passing attendant. "Why haven't we turned around?" Their voices carried pure fear, now stripped of the authority they displayed when mocking other passengers. Panic looked the same on everyone, regardless of rank. The intercom finally came alive with the captain's voice. Calm, but carrying an undertone that made experienced travelers sit up straight. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Michael Reynolds. We are experiencing technical difficulties with several of our systems in working through our checklist. Please remain seated with seatbelts fastened while we resolve this situation." The message ended, leaving silence that felt heavier than the smoke. Whispers began spreading like infection. "Engine trouble. Electrical fire. We're going down." Alex sat perfectly still, cataloging everything her training had taught her to notice. The uneven tone in the left engine now clearly audible. The subtle delay in the aircraft's response when it adjusted for air currents. The faint metallic groaning that spoke of systems working harder than designed. This wasn't routine turbulence or minor technical glitch. This was cascading system failure, the kind emergency flight crews train for but hope never to face. She'd been here before in different aircraft over different continents. In Afghanistan, watching a Chinook limp home on one screaming engine. Inside an Apache when power surge fried half the avionics mid-mission. Both times survival had come down to calm hands and fast decisions by people who understood that machines could be coaxed through failure if you knew how to listen. 10 minutes crawled by like hours. The electronic smell had spread despite ventilation working overtime. Passengers sat rigid. Every face turned toward the ceiling whenever lights flickered, which they did with increasing frequency. The left engine's tone continued its irregular rhythm. Flight attendants moved through the aisles with clipboards and forced smiles, conducting routine safety checks that Alex recognized as preparation for emergency procedures. Securing loose items, identifying passengers needing assistance, positioning emergency equipment. Then something happened that Alex had never seen on a commercial flight. The cockpit door opened. Captain Michael Reynolds stepped into the cabin, and his presence changed the entire atmosphere. Not tall in a way that dominated space, but carrying himself with controlled authority that made narrow aisles seem to widen around him. Close-cropped gray hair, weathered face uniform, pressed despite the stress. His eyes swept the cabin, sharp practiced cataloging details most would miss. Reeves and Harris pounced like starving animals. Finally, the Reeves barked, lurching from his seat. "What the hell is happening? This whole flight's a disaster. Why haven't you turned us around? We demand answers." Harris joined in with similar protests, his voice pitched higher with panic. Captain Reynolds didn't break stride. He looked at them with flat professional assessment that reduced grown men to children and dismissed them with a glance so final it cut off their protests. Then his gaze swept past them, scanning economy until it locked on exactly who he was looking for. "Captain Morgan." Alex's head snapped up. Hearing her rank and name in the captain's mouth was like being struck by lightning. Unexpected. Precise. "Yes, sir," she answered carefully. "Air Force Aircraft Maintenance Officer. Combat Systems Specialist for F-16s and C-130s. Purple Heart recipient from action under fire at Baghdad Air Base." His voice wasn't asking for confirmation. It was verifying information he already possessed. Around her, passengers stared with new eyes, reassessing the woman they had ignored moments before. "That's correct, sir," Alex said, her throat suddenly dry. "How did you passenger manifest list more than names and seat assignments?" His words were clipped. "Urgent. Right now I have a situation developing that's not covered in any manual, and I need someone with hands-on experience looking at problems my instruments can't diagnose." The silence that fell over surrounding rows was absolute. Passengers who'd been whispering prayers suddenly found themselves listening to a conversation that sounded like setup for either salvation or disaster. Reeves shot up from his seat, indignation overriding panic. "Wait just a minute. She's not qualified for—" Captain Reynolds turned on him with movements sharp enough to cut glass. "Captain Morgan has more hands-on turbine experience than my entire flight crew combined. She's troubleshot mechanical failures in combat conditions that would ground this aircraft permanently." He stepped closer to Reeves' voice, dropping to a register only military men would recognize. The tone of absolute command that brooked no argument. "You want to help save this flight? Sit down, shut up, and let me work with someone who knows the difference between theory and practice." The words hit first class like physical force. Mouths hung open, faces flushed red, but no sound came out. The men who'd spent the flight mocking her competence now found themselves dismissed by someone whose opinion actually mattered. Every eye in surrounding rows fixed on Alex. She felt the weight of their attention. The sudden shift in perception as people reassessed everything they thought they knew about the quiet woman in seat 29E. Captain Reynolds extended his hand toward her. Not ceremonial, just direct. "Captain Morgan, I need you in my cockpit now." Military training moved her body before conscious thought caught up. She unbuckled Rose from the cramped economy seat and stepped into the aisle. Whispers followed her movement, like a wake, some incredulous, some relieved, some ashamed of earlier assumptions. She walked past Reeves and Harris, both red-faced and staring at their shoes, neither able to meet her eyes. For the first time since boarding, they had nothing to say. As she passed Rodriguez, the flight attendant gave her a small nod of unexpected respect. Captain Reynolds led her toward the front, past the curtain separating passengers from crew, toward the door that sealed the cockpit from the rest of the world. As it closed behind them, cabin murmurs faded, leaving only strained machinery and alarms waiting for someone who could understand what they were really saying. In that moment, Alex Morgan stopped being the humiliated passenger from row 29E. She became the only thing standing between 200 lives and the Atlantic Ocean 36,000 feet below. Reynolds leaned close as they approached the cockpit door, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Morgan," he said, a strange emotion flashing across his weathered face. "Any relation to Captain Richard Morgan, Desert Talons, 91. Alex froze her hand halfway to the cockpit door. "He was my father." Reynolds' eyes softened for just a moment before professional duty reasserted itself. I thought so. The resemblance is there around the eyes. He tapped the Desert Talons insignia on his watch. We flew together. He was a damn good pilot. Before Alex could process this revelation, Reynolds was moving again, punching the security code into the cockpit door. We'll talk about that later. Right now, I need the daughter's skills more than I need memories of the father. The door swung open to reveal a cockpit alive with warning lights and urgent alarms. The co-pilot, a young woman with blonde hair pulled into a tight bun, looked up with a mixture of relief and apprehension. Captain, Alex whispered, staring out the windscreen at dark clouds building on the horizon. Something's wrong with this bird. More than you know, Reynolds replied grimly, and we're flying straight into a storm. The cockpit was smaller than people imagined and louder than anyone expected. Warning lights painted instrument panels in reds and ambers that pulsed like angry heartbeats, while alarms competed for attention in frequencies designed to trigger immediate response. The air was thick with heat and tension tinged with that bitter smell of electronics pushed beyond limits. Captain Reynolds slid back into the left seat while his first officer, Jennifer Collins, remained hunched over displays showing more problems than solutions. Hydraulic pressure fluctuating wildly. Engine temperature spiking. Autopilot system completely dark. Captain Morgan, observer seat, Reynolds ordered, pointing to the small jump seat behind them. Strap in tight. Alex dropped into the cramped seat and pulled the 4-point harness across her chest. The space was designed for emergency inspectors rather than comfort, but she'd spent years working in spaces even smaller. What are we looking at? She asked, leaning forward to scan the instrumentation. Reynolds' voice cut through the electronic chaos. We've lost multiple redundant systems simultaneously. Autopilot's dead. Left engine running rough. Hydraulics bleeding pressure faster than we can compensate. His hands moved across the controls with practiced efficiency. Every checklist we've run comes back negative. Systems that should work don't. Backups that should engage won't. Collins turned briefly, sweat beading despite air conditioning. Sir, with respect, she's a passenger. Protocol doesn't cover what we're dealing with, Reynolds snapped. Right now, I need someone who's lived inside these systems, not just trained on them. Alex leaned forward, eyes moving across the instrument array with systematic approach she'd developed over years of troubleshooting under pressure. She ignored alarms and focused on patterns, relationships between failing systems, timing of warning cascades, mechanical symptoms computers couldn't interpret. The CFM56-5B engine on the left wing was struggling, not failing catastrophically, but fighting against something. The digital displays showed temperature readings in the danger zone, but the engine sound didn't match what she'd expect from genuine thermal stress. Something wasn't adding up. Your port side temperature sensor is giving false readings, she said after 30 seconds of analysis. It's showing thermal stress that isn't there. If you throttle back based on that data, you'll starve the engine and lose it completely. Collins blinked, glancing between instruments and Alex's face. Reynolds' hand moved immediately to throttle controls, making minute adjustments that smoothed out the left engine's irregular rhythm. How can you tell? Collins asked. Exhaust pattern visible through cabin windows doesn't match the temperature readout. Also, vibration frequency is wrong for thermal stress. It's electrical interference feeding false data. Alex pointed to a secondary display. Your backup sensor array is still functioning. Cross-reference the readings. Reynolds followed her guidance and immediately the engine stabilized. Not perfect, but no longer threatening to quit entirely. Outstanding, Reynolds muttered. What else? Alex studied the electrical system readouts. Multiple circuit breakers had tripped, but in a pattern that made no sense for standard failure modes. It was as though the aircraft's central nervous system was short-circuiting, sending contradictory signals to critical components. You've got cascading electrical interference affecting multiple systems, she said. It's not just the temperature sensors. Your hydraulic pressure gauges are compromised too. She pointed to the fluctuating readings. The physical symptoms don't match these readings. The vibration pattern suggests a cross-feed valve stuck partially open, bleeding pressure into the wrong circuit and confusing diagnostics. Reynolds nodded, processing her assessment. Manual override on hydraulics. Reroute through auxiliary, Alex confirmed. You can stabilize rudder control long enough to get us down. Collins hesitated, looking to Reynolds for confirmation. He nodded immediately. Do it. The first officer's hands moved across controls, implementing Alex's suggestions. Hydraulic pressure stabilized, rudder response smoothed out, and for the first time in 20 minutes, the aircraft felt under control rather than barely contained. Jesus, Collins muttered. How did you? I've patched this exact failure configuration on a C-130 in combat conditions, Alex said simply. Your bird's more sophisticated, but fundamental systems are similar. Metal and physics work the same way whether you're over Afghanistan or the Atlantic. Reynolds turned to look at her directly. Captain Morgan, you're not leaving this cockpit until we're on the ground. Clear. Yes, sir. Collins pointed to another display where electrical system warnings continued to flash. We've still got multiple failures in the avionics. FADEC is giving erratic commands to both engines now. Reynolds frowned. Full authority digital engine control shouldn't fail like this. It has triple redundancy. It's not failing mechanically, Alex said, studying the patterns. This looks like electromagnetic interference. Almost like she stopped a memory surfacing from her deployment days. Captain, has this aircraft undergone any special modifications or been used for any military purposes? Reynolds' head snapped around, eyes narrowing. Why do you ask? Because I've seen this interference pattern before. In Iraq, we had a C-17 with similar symptoms after installing experimental countermeasures against electronic warfare. The systems created unintentional feedback loops with civilian avionics. Something flickered across Reynolds' face. Recognition. Concern. First Officer Collins, take the controls, he ordered, then unbuckled and gestured for Alex to follow him to the rear of the cockpit. When they were as private as possible in the confined space, Reynolds lowered his voice. This Airbus was part of a joint civilian-military test program 3 years ago. Project Cyber Shield. It was briefly retrofitted with hardened avionics systems designed to resist electronic attack. And then returned to civilian service, Alex asked, disbelief evident in her voice. Reynolds nodded grimly. The program was classified. When the test concluded, the aircraft was supposed to be completely restored to stock configuration. But if what you're suggesting is true, some of the experimental hardware is still installed and creating conflicts with the civilian systems. Alex finished. The electromagnetic signatures are unmistakable. Reynolds ran a hand across his face. Damn it, that explains why none of the standard procedures are working. A violent shudder ran through the airframe, causing both of them to grab handholds. We need to get back to our seats, Reynolds said. But first, that's not all you recognized, is it? Alex met his gaze. No, sir. The Desert Talon's insignia. My father flew with that squadron. Richard Morgan wasn't just in my squadron, Captain. He was my wingman. The best damn pilot I ever flew with. Reynolds' weathered face softened momentarily. He saved my life over Baghdad by drawing enemy fire away from my damaged aircraft. I never got to thank him. Before Alex could respond, another alarm sounded from the main console. Collins called out, Captain, we've got smoke in the cabin again. Passenger oxygen masks will deploy automatically if it gets worse. We'll continue this later, Reynolds said, squeezing Alex's shoulder briefly. Right now, I need the maintenance officer, not the daughter. Alex nodded, compartmentalizing emotions as she'd been trained to do. Yes, sir. They returned to their positions as the plane lurched again, more violently this time. Collins fought the controls as the aircraft banked unexpectedly to the right. Manual flight controls are getting sluggish, she reported. Hydraulic pressure dropping again. Alex leaned forward between the seats. The cross-feed valve problem is worsening. You need to isolate the primary hydraulic circuit completely and operate on the backup system only. That leaves us with minimal redundancy, Collins objected. Better than cascading failure, Reynolds countered, already implementing Alex's suggestion. Do it. In the main cabin, thin wisps of smoke continued to seep from the ventilation system. The electronic smell grew stronger. Passengers clutched armrests as the aircraft pitched and rolled through turbulence that wasn't entirely natural. What's our nearest diversion airport? Reynolds asked. Collins pulled up the navigation display. With our current position over the mid-Atlantic, we're looking at either a return to Ireland or pushing forward to Lodge's Field in the Azores. Reynolds considered the options, factoring in their deteriorating systems. How's the weather at Lodges? Not good, Collins replied. Major storm system moving through. Winds gusting to 50 knots, heavy precipitation. In Ireland, better conditions, but it's 2 hours back the way we came. That's 2 more hours of systems degradation. Reynolds made the decision. Lodged it is. Inform ATC we're declaring an emergency and diverting immediately. He turned to Alex. Captain Morgan, what else can we do to stabilize these systems? Alex studied the avionics displays, mind racing through potential solutions. If the problem is leftover experimental hardware interfering with civilian systems, we need to identify which components are causing the conflict and isolate them. How do we do that without a schematic of classified modifications? Collins asked. We look for patterns in the failures, Alex replied. Each system that goes down gives us a clue about what's still installed. Reynolds nodded, understanding her approach. Like tracking a virus by its symptoms. Exactly. Alex began methodically analyzing the failure sequence, noting which systems failed first and how the cascades propagated. A pattern emerged. The failures all originated from the aircraft's central avionics bay, specifically the area that housed the AirInc 429 data bus that served as the nervous system for modern aircraft. Captain, I think I know what's happening, she said. This aircraft still has a military-grade data filtering system installed. It was designed to prevent electronic warfare attacks by screening all data moving through the ARInc 429 bus. But civilian software updates over the past 3 years have made it incompatible. The filter is now rejecting legitimate commands as potential threats. Can we bypass it? Reynolds asked. Not entirely, but we might be able to force it into passive mode if we can locate the physical hardware. Reynolds frowned. That would mean accessing the avionics bay beneath the cockpit floor. Not exactly standard procedure during flight. Neither is having experimental military hardware on a civilian aircraft, Alex countered. Do we have access? Emergency maintenance panel, Reynolds confirmed. But it's a tight space. I've worked in tighter, Alex assured him. A new alarm blared, cutting through their conversation. Collins's voice was tight with tension. Captain, weather radar shows the storm intensifying at Lodges. Conditions are deteriorating rapidly. Reynolds scanned the latest weather update. The storm that had been merely concerning 15 minutes ago was now developing into something far more dangerous. Wind speeds increasing, cloud tops climbing to 40,000 feet, a wall of intense precipitation blocking their approach path. How long until we reach Lodges airspace? He asked. 90 minutes at current speed, Collins replied, but we'll hit the leading edge of the storm in 30. Reynolds weighed their diminishing options. Return to Europe meant at least 2 more hours of flying with failing systems. Push through to Lodges meant confronting severe weather with compromised controls. Neither choice offered safety. We continued to Lodges, he decided. But first we need to try Captain Morgan's suggestion. Prepare the access panel. While Collins coordinated with the air traffic control, Reynolds helped Alex remove the small access panel in the cockpit floor. A narrow opening revealed the cramped avionics bay below, packed with electronics and wiring harnesses. The military modifications would be integrated with the main data bus controllers, Alex said, studying the complex array of equipment. Look for anything non-standard, possibly with military serial numbers or different manufacturing colors. Reynolds shone a flashlight into the compartment. There, he pointed, that black box with the gold edge connector. Standard Airbus components are gray or blue. Alex nodded. That's it. Hand me the maintenance tablet. Using the aircraft's diagnostic system, she confirmed her suspicions. The mysterious black module was intercepting and filtering all data traffic on the main bus, and its rejection parameters were becoming increasingly aggressive as the civilian systems attempted to compensate for failures. We can't remove it without shutting down all electrical systems, she explained. But we might be able to force it into diagnostic mode, which should stop it from filtering commands. How do we do that? Reynolds asked. Military hardware typically has a maintenance override, usually a specific sequence of power cycles combined with a physical reset. Alex studied the module carefully. There, that small red button recessed in the housing. That's a standard military reset switch. You're sure about this? Reynolds asked. If we crash that module, we could lose all avionics at once. Alex met his gaze steadily. If we do nothing, we'll lose them one by one anyway. Better to act on our terms than react to the next failure. Reynolds held her gaze for a moment, then nodded. Do it. Alex reached into the narrow opening, stretching her arm to its full length to reach the module. Her fingers found the reset button just as the aircraft pitched suddenly, throwing her against the edge of the access panel. She grimaced but maintained her position. Holding the reset button, she called out, "Captain, cycle the avionics master switch on my mark." Reynolds positioned his hand over the switch. Ready? 3, 2, 1 mark. The cockpit displays went dark as Reynolds cut power to the avionics systems. In the darkness, Alex pressed firmly on the reset button, feeling it click beneath her finger. Power up in 3, 2, 1 Cheyenne. Reynolds restored power. The displays flickered, running through initialization sequences. Warning messages scrolled across the screens as systems came back online. For a terrible moment, nothing changed. Then one by one, the error messages began to clear. The hydraulic pressure stabilized, engine temperature readings normalized. The constant electronic interference diminished. "It's working," Collins reported, relief evident in her voice. "FADEC is responding normally. Hydraulic pressure stabilizing." Alex withdrew her arm from the access panel, a thin line of blood visible where the metal edge had caught her skin during turbulence. The filter module is in passive monitoring mode now. It's still installed, but it's no longer rejecting legitimate commands. Reynolds nodded approvingly. "Outstanding work, Captain." "We're not out of danger yet," Alex cautioned. "The systems are stabilized but damaged, and we still have a storm to fly through." As if to emphasize her point, the aircraft suddenly dropped several hundred feet as it encountered the leading edge of the weather system. Overhead in the main cabin, oxygen masks deployed automatically as the cabin pressure fluctuated. "Lodge's tower is reporting deteriorating conditions," Collins announced. "Crosswinds at 40 knots gusting to 60, heavy rain, visibility down to 1 mile. "Inform them we're continuing the approach," Reynolds ordered. "We'll take whatever runway they can give us." Alex secured the access panel and returned to her seat as Reynolds addressed the passengers through the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Reynolds. We've resolved our primary technical issues, but we'll be making an emergency landing at Lodge's Air Base in the Azores due to continuing concerns. We're about to enter some significant weather, so please remain in your seats with seatbelts securely fastened." In the passenger cabin, Reeves and Harris listened to the announcement with vastly different expressions. Harris remained pale, fingers digging into his armrests, eyes wide with barely contained panic. But something had shifted in Reeves' demeanor. The arrogance had faded, replaced by a grim determination that spoke to his military training. As panic spread among the other first-class passengers, Reeves unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up. "Everyone listen up," he called out, his voice carrying the authority of command. "I'm Commander James Reeves, U.S. Navy SEALs. This aircraft is in good hands. Captain Reynolds is one of the best pilots in the business, and apparently," he added with a hint of humility, "we have a highly skilled maintenance officer in the cockpit as well." Flight Attendant Rodriguez approached him. "Sir, you need to return to your seat immediately." Reeves nodded. "Altaden, I will, but first you need help preparing the cabin for an emergency landing." He lowered his voice. "I've been through this before. Let me assist." Rodriguez hesitated, then nodded. "Thank you, Commander." As Reeves helped organize the passengers, checking seatbelts and securing loose items, he found himself at Harris's seat. "Pull yourself together, Lieutenant Colonel," he said firmly. "These people need leadership, not another person to manage." Harris swallowed hard, fighting his fear. "Yes, sir." Reeves continued moving through the cabin, his military bearing providing a calm presence that helped settle the panicked passengers. As he worked, his mind kept returning to a mission gone wrong in the Persian Gulf back in 1991. He'd been overconfident then, too dismissive of support personnel, convinced that operators like him were all that mattered. That arrogance had cost 2 men their lives when their extraction helicopter crashed due to maintenance issues he'd dismissed as insignificant. The memory had faded over the years, buried beneath layers of accomplishment and self-justification. Until today. Back in the cockpit, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. The storm enveloped the aircraft completely now, tossing it through violent updrafts and downdrafts. Rain pelted the windscreen with such force it sounded like gravel. Lightning flashed continuously, momentarily blinding the pilots. "Lodge's Tower, British Airways, 283. We are 12 miles from the outer marker, requesting emergency landing clearance." Collins called into the radio. The response came back, broken by static. British 283 Lodges Tower, cleared for emergency landing runway 33. Be advised conditions now below minimums. Wind 320 at 45 knots gusting 65. Visibility 3/4 mile and heavy precipitation. Decision yours to continue. Reynolds exchanged glances with Collins. Below minimums meant conditions had deteriorated beyond what regulations allowed for safe landings. Any normal flight would divert elsewhere, but they had nowhere else to go. Acknowledge Lodges. We're continuing approach, Reynolds responded. Collins's hands were white-knuckled on the controls. Captain, I've never landed in conditions this severe. I have, Reynolds said calmly, in an F-18 with battle damage. We'll get through this. He turned to Alex. Captain and Morgan, what else should we prepare for? Alex had been studying the systems displays. The repairs they'd made were holding, but the aircraft was still compromised. The landing gear hydraulics are showing strain. We might need to deploy gear using gravity drop rather than hydraulic pressure. Emergency extension procedure. Reynolds nodded. What about the thrust reversers? We'll need maximum braking capability on a wet runway. Right engine reversers look good, Alex replied after checking the indicators. Left engine is questionable. I'd plan for asymmetric thrust on rollout. Noted, Reynolds said, then turned to Collins. Jennifer, I'll take the controls for landing. You manage communications and systems monitoring. Yes, sir, Collins replied, relieved to hand over the primary flying duties. The aircraft broke through a cloud layer, giving them a momentary glimpse of the island below, before being swallowed again by storm clouds. Lodges Air Base, originally constructed during World War II as a strategic mid-Atlantic refueling point, appeared and disappeared through gaps in the clouds, a narrow strip of concrete on a plateau overlooking the ocean. Beginning final approach, Reynolds announced, his voice steady as he guided the wounded aircraft toward the barely visible runway. Gear down. Collins activated the landing gear lever. Warning lights immediately flashed on the panel. Negative gear indication, she reported tensely. Hydraulic pressure insufficient for normal extension. Initiating emergency gear extension, Reynolds replied calmly. Captain Morgan assists with the manual release. Alex reached for the emergency gear extension handle, pulling it firmly to mechanically unlock the gear doors. Gravity extension initiated. The aircraft shuddered as the landing gear fell free, relying on gravity rather than hydraulic pressure to lock into position. After several tense seconds, the indicator lights changed. 3 green, Collins confirmed. Gear down and locked. Reynolds nodded, his focus entirely on the approach. The aircraft bucked and rolled in the powerful crosswinds, requiring constant corrections to maintain the approach path. Rain streamed across the windscreen, visibility limited to brief glimpses of runway lights through the downpour. 1,000 feet, Collins called out. Reading from the radar altimeter, Reynolds made a slight adjustment to counter a sudden gust. Runway in sight, continuing approach. 500 feet. The aircraft lurched, suddenly caught in a violent downdraft that pushed them below the optimal glide path. Reynolds reacted instantly, adding power to arrest their descent. 400, 300. Alex watched the engine indicators carefully. Left engine still stable but showing fluctuations. Right engine nominal. 200 feet, minimums. At this point in a normal approach, they would abort if the runway wasn't clearly visible. But these weren't normal circumstances. Through sheets of rain, the runway lights appeared as hazy blurs. 100 feet. Reynolds' hands were perfectly steady on the controls, making constant small adjustments to counter the gusting crosswind. His voice remained calm. Prepare for touchdown. 50, 40, 30. The aircraft crossed the runway threshold, still fighting the crosswind. Reynolds adjusted their alignment with practiced precision. 20, 10. Reynolds pulled back slightly on the controls, raising the nose for touchdown. The aircraft settled toward the rain-soaked runway. Impact. The landing gear slammed into concrete with a sound like artillery fire. The aircraft bounced once hard enough to lift everyone against restraints before wheels bit down and held. Immediately, Reynolds deployed the thrust reversers and applied maximum braking. The right engine responded perfectly, thrust reverser deploying to help slow the massive aircraft. But as Alex had predicted, the left engine hesitated. The asymmetric braking force caused the aircraft to yaw left toward the edge of the runway. Compensating way, Reynolds called out it, applying right rudder to correct their path. Smoke poured from the brakes as they fought against momentum and weather. The entire airframe shuddered with the violence of the controlled crash. Warnings blared as systems registered the extreme stresses being placed on the landing, gear, and airframe. Slowly, agonizingly, the aircraft's speed bled away. The end of the runway approached rapidly, emergency arresting gear visible through the rain. But they were slowing faster than the distance was diminishing. Finally, the aircraft ground to a complete stop near the midpoint of the runway. For 10 seconds, there was no sound except the tick of cooling metal and drum of rain against aluminum skin. Then, as if released from a spell, the entire cabin erupted in applause and sobbing and laughter that sounded like hysteria but felt like rebirth. They were alive. All of them. Captain Reynolds reached over and shut down the engines, his movements deliberate and final. In the sudden quiet, he turned to look at Alex, rain streaking the windscreen behind him like tears. "Captain Morgan," he said, his voice carrying weight no regulation manual could define. "That landing goes in your logbook, too." She held his gaze and nodded once. There was nothing else that needed saying. Emergency crews swarmed the aircraft within minutes, surrounding it with flashing lights that reflected off the rain-soaked runway. Fire trucks positioned themselves strategically, ready to respond if the situation deteriorated further. Medical personnel prepared to receive any injured passengers. As the cabin door finally opened, cold Azorean air rushed in, carrying the smell of rain and aviation fuel and the indefinable scent of safety. Passengers were evacuated methodically, moving down inflatable slides to waiting buses that would transport them to the terminal. In the midst of the controlled chaos, Commander Reeves found himself standing next to Lieutenant Colonel Harris in the shelter of the terminal building. Both men were soaked from the brief journey across the tarmac, but while Harris still looked shaken, Reeves's expression had transformed completely. "I owe that woman an apology," he said quietly, watching as the last passengers were evacuated. Harris looked surprised. "The mechanic, why we couldn't have known she'd be useful." Reeves turned to his colleague, disappointment evident in his expression. "That's exactly the point, Thomas. We made assumptions based on nothing but our own prejudices. We dismissed someone because of their role rather than their capabilities." He shook his head. "That kind of thinking gets people killed in the field. I should know better." "It's not that serious," Harris protested. "It was just a seating arrangement." "No," Reeves said firmly. "It was arrogance. The same arrogance that cost me 2 men in 91 when I ignored maintenance warnings from support staff because I thought operators knew better." He looked toward the aircraft where Alex could be seen emerging from the cockpit. "I've made that mistake before. I won't make it again." The storm still hammered the runway outside, turning tarmac into a lake of reflected emergency lights. But inside, there was only the stunned quiet of people processing their own survival. Evelyn emerged from the aircraft into the chaos of flashing lights and shouted instructions, rain soaking through her jacket within seconds. She stood for a moment beside the landing gear, looking up at the aircraft that had carried them all through impossible conditions. The Airbus looked smaller on the ground, scarred but intact. Rain-washing stress marks from its aluminum skin. Battle damage, she thought, the kind of wear that marked machines and people who'd been tested beyond design limits and survived anyway. "Captain." She turned to find Captain Reynolds approaching through the rain, his uniform jacket dark with water, but posture still carrying command authority. Without hesitation, in full view of passengers still moving toward the terminal, emergency personnel conducting organized chaos, and ground crews working around landing gear, Reynolds came to attention and rendered a sharp, deliberate salute. It wasn't ceremony, it wasn't protocol. It was recognition from one professional to another. Acknowledgement of competence demonstrated under pressure that had saved lives when everything else failed. The gesture cut through noise and confusion like a signal flare. Ground crew members stopped their work. Passengers waiting at the bottom of stairs turned to watch. Emergency responders paused in their duties. Alex returned the salute with equal precision. Water dripping from her hair movements, carrying 12 years of military training that had prepared her for moments exactly like this one. Nearby, Reeves and Harris had reached the bottom of stairs. They stood apart from other passengers, both soaked and shivering, watching an exchange that reframed everything they'd thought they understood about competence and worth. Reeves managed to catch her eye as she lowered her hand. His face flushed with shame, he gave a stiff, awkward nod, that might have been an apology if he'd been capable of speaking. Harris simply looked away, studying his shoes like they held answers to questions he didn't want to ask. But Alex didn't linger on them. Apologies and acknowledgments from people who'd revealed their character weren't necessary. Dignity had a way of restoring itself without requiring validation from those who'd tried to take it away. She shouldered her duffel bag, water streaming from its canvas sides, and began walking toward terminal lights that promised warmth in dry clothes and the kind of mundane comfort that felt miraculous after 90 minutes of wondering whether she'd ever experience ordinary things again. As she walked, Reynolds fell into step beside her. "We need to talk," he said quietly, "about your father." Alex nodded, emotions she'd held at bay during the crisis finally beginning to surface. "Yes, sir, I think we do." Behind them, the aircraft sat quietly in the rain, emergency lights still strobing across its wings. Tomorrow, investigators would examine every system document, every failure, write reports that would become case studies in aviation maintenance programs. But none of that analysis would capture what really happened during those crucial minutes. The moment when theoretical knowledge met practical experience. When years of working with machines in impossible conditions translated into the ability to keep those machines running when everything logical said they should fail. Alex had felt the weight of humiliation when escorted from first class carrying it like a stone, while officers who'd never turned a wrench made jokes about her competence. But that weight was gone, now dissolved somewhere over the Atlantic between crisis and resolution. Because in the end, when metal screamed and electronics failed and 200 lives hung in the balance, there had been no question about who belonged in that cockpit. She'd earned her place there the same way she'd earned everything else, through simple willingness to know her job completely and do it without asking for recognition. As she approached the terminal building, Alex glanced back one last time at the aircraft silhouetted against the stormy sky. For all its sophisticated technology, it had ultimately been saved by something far more fundamental: human skill and determination. That was a lesson worth remembering. For everyone. The Lajes Air Base Operations Center hummed with the controlled chaos that follows any aviation emergency. Military personnel moved with practiced efficiency, processing passengers, coordinating with civilian authorities, and documenting every aspect of the incident. Outside, the storm continued its assault, sheets of rain punctuated by lightning that illuminated the grounded aircraft in stark, dramatic flashes. In a small conference room away from the passenger processing area, Alex Morgan sat across from Captain Michael Reynolds. Between them, 2 steaming cups of coffee provided warmth and a momentary comfort neither had expected to experience again just hours earlier. They were alone, the room's utilitarian government furniture and fluorescent lighting, creating an atmosphere both familiar and strangely intimate. "I recognized your name on the manifest." Reynolds began, his weathered hands wrapped around his coffee mug. "Morgan isn't uncommon, but something made me check your service record. When I saw Air Force Maintenance Purple Heart recipient, I wondered. But you weren't sure until you saw me?" Alex said, understanding. Reynolds nodded. The eyes gave it away. Richard had the same intensity when he was solving a problem. That same focus. Alex felt a complex wave of emotions. For years, she'd collected fragments of her father like precious artifacts, anecdotes from his squadron mates, official commendations, the rare photograph. Now sitting across from his wingman, she found herself suddenly hesitant. "How well did you know him?" she asked finally. Reynolds set down his coffee. "We flew together for 3 years, roommates at Nellis during Top Gun, best man at my wedding." A sad smile crossed his face. He was the most natural pilot I've ever seen, the kind who felt the aircraft rather than just flying it. "My mother always said he could hear what was wrong with an engine before the instruments showed it," Alex said softly. She wasn't exaggerating. During Desert Storm, we were running combat air patrols north of Kuwait. Richard detected a compressor problem in my F-18 before my warning systems activated. Made me return to base while he took my patrol slot. Reynolds paused, his eyes focusing on something distant. "That's why he was there that day flying my mission." Alex felt her throat tighten. "The day he was shot down." Reynolds nodded, his expression solemn. "January 17, 1991. We were providing air support for a special operations extraction that had gone sideways. Heavy anti-aircraft fire. Richard called out that he'd draw their attention while I covered the extractions helicopter." His voice grew quiet. He called it making noise in the wrong neighborhood. Typical Richard. What happened? Alex asked, though part of her didn't want to know. He did exactly what he promised. Made himself the biggest target in the sky, pulling maneuvers that had those anti-aircraft batteries firing everything they had at him instead of the extraction team. It worked. The helicopter got our men out. Reynolds swallowed hard. But Richard took a direct hit to his port engine. The aircraft went into an unrecoverable spin. No ejection, Alex said. It wasn't a question. She'd read the official report. No ejection, Reynolds confirmed. The investigation suggested the canopy mechanism was damaged in the strike. But Richard, he stayed with it long enough to guide the falling aircraft away from a civilian area. He looked directly at Alex. He saved 37 lives on the ground, and 6 men on that helicopter, including me. Alex sat very still, absorbing this new information about her father's final moments. The official report had been clinically sparse. Aircraft down, pilot KIA, mission parameters classified. I've spent 30 years trying to honor that sacrifice, Reynolds continued. Finished my Navy career, moved to commercial aviation, tried to fly with the same precision and care he always showed. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object, placing it on the table between them. And I've carried this since that day. It was a weathered challenge coin, the kind military units exchanged as tokens of membership and respect. This one bore the Desert Talons insignia on one side. Alex turned it over to find her father's name and call sign engraved on the reverse. Quicksilver, she read aloud, running her thumb over the letters. For his reflexes, Reynolds explained, and his personality. Always moving, always thinking impossible to pin down. He paused. I wanted to give that to you after the funeral, but my unit was immediately redeployed. By the time I returned stateside, you and your mother had moved. I tried to find you a few times over the years, but we moved around a lot, Alex acknowledged. Mom took a teaching position in Germany, then Colorado. I enlisted right after high school. Reynolds nodded, following in his footsteps. Not exactly, Alex said, a hint of old defensiveness creeping into her voice. I wanted to be a pilot, but my eyesight wasn't quite good enough. Maintenance was the closest I could get to the aircraft. And yet today proved it was exactly where you needed to be, Reynolds replied. Richard would have been the first to tell you that. He always said the maintenance crews were the real heroes. Pilots just borrow the planes, he used to say. The mechanics own them. Alex smiled, something tight in her chest finally loosening. I never knew that. There's a lot about your father I could tell you, Reynolds said. But first we need to discuss what happened on that aircraft. His expression grew serious. The experimental systems you identified weren't supposed to be there. That Airbus was certified as fully restored to civilian specification 3 years ago. Clearly it wasn't, Alex replied. The electromagnetic interference patterns were unmistakable. Military-grade countermeasures still installed and actively conflicting with civilian avionics. Which raises some very serious questions about the decommissioning process, Reynolds agreed. Questions that certain people at the Pentagon are going to have to answer. A knock at the door interrupted them. A young Air Force lieutenant entered, snapping to attention when he recognized Reynolds' captain's uniform. Sir, the Air Force Incident Response Team has arrived from Ramstein. Colonel Hargrove requests your presence for the preliminary briefing. Reynolds nodded. Tell him we'll be right there. As the lieutenant withdrew, Reynolds turned back to Alex. This is going to be a long night. The military doesn't take kindly to classified systems nearly bringing down a civilian aircraft. Who does the classification on Project Cyber Shield? Alex asked. Air Force-Navy Joint Program. DARPA initiative with multi-service implementation, Reynolds replied, which means the finger-pointing has already begun. By morning, there will be generals from 3 branches trying to figure out how experimental counter-electronic warfare systems ended up on a British Airways flight. Alex considered this. They'll try to bury it. Classified mission national security implications. Probably, Reynolds agreed. But that doesn't change what happened up there. He stood straightening his uniform jacket. And it doesn't change the fact that 200 people are alive because of your expertise. Let's make sure that part stays in the official record. Together they walked through the base corridors toward the Incident Command Center. The storm outside had begun to abate, the worst of its fury spent. Through windows, Alex could see the grounded Airbus surrounded by floodlights and technical crews, its massive form gleaming wet in the artificial illumination. The incident command center had been established in the base's main briefing room. As Alex and Reynolds entered, conversations quieted momentarily. Several military officers in various service uniforms stood around a large table covered with aircraft schematics and preliminary reports. At the head of the table stood an Air Force colonel with silver hair and the ramrod-straight posture of a career officer. "Captain Reynolds," the colonel acknowledged. "I'm Colonel James Hargrove, Air Force Aviation Incident Response. I understand we have you to thank for getting that aircraft on the ground in one piece." "Not just me, Colonel," Reynolds replied. "This is Captain Alexandra Morgan, Air Force, former aircraft maintenance officer with extensive combat experience. Without her expertise, we wouldn't be having this conversation." Hargrove's eyebrows rose slightly. "Captain Morgan, you were a passenger?" "Yes, sir," Alex replied. "Originally seated in economy, but Captain Reynolds requested my assistance in the cockpit when systems began failing." "Fortunate coincidence," Hargrove remarked, his tone carefully neutral. Reynolds stepped forward. "No coincidence about it, Colonel. Captain Morgan identified the source of our system's failures: experimental military hardware that wasn't properly removed during decommissioning. Hardware related to Project Cyber Shield." The room went silent. Several officers exchanged worried glances. "That's a classified program, Captain Reynolds," Hargrove said quietly. "It's also the reason 200 civilians nearly died today," Reynolds countered. Captain Morgan recognized the electromagnetic interference patterns from her deployment experience. She correctly identified a military-grade data filtering system still installed on the Arank 429 bus, a system that was actively rejecting legitimate commands from civilian avionics. Hargrove's expression remained impassive, but Alex noticed his posture stiffened slightly. "We'll need to continue this discussion in a secure environment. Lieutenant," he addressed a young officer near the door, "please escort all non-essential personnel out." "Captain Morgan stays," Reynolds said firmly. "She's the only one who directly observed and diagnosed the problem. Without her statement, your investigation will be incomplete." Hargrove considered this for a moment, then nodded. "Very well, but this information does not leave this room. Is that understood?" As the room cleared of civilian personnel and junior officers, Hargrove activated an electronic countermeasures device on the table, standard procedure for classified discussions. "Now," he said, once they were secure, "explain exactly what you observed, Captain Morgan." For the next hour, Alex detailed her observations and actions, from the first indications of electrical interference to the final manual reset of the military hardware. She provided technical specifications, failure sequences, and specific electromagnetic signatures that identified the military system. Throughout her explanation, the senior officers listened with growing concern. "This is extremely troubling," Hargrove said when she finished. "Project Cyber Shield was discontinued precisely because of integration issues with civilian systems. All test aircraft were supposed to be completely restored to original configuration." "Obviously, that didn't happen," Reynolds pointed out. "No," Hargrove agreed, "it didn't. The question is why and how many other aircraft might be affected." One of the Navy captains cleared his throat. "Colonel, given the classified nature of this incident, what will the official report indicate?" The implication was clear. Alex had seen it before: the military's instinct to protect sensitive information, even at the cost of transparency. "The official report will reflect the truth," Reynolds interjected before Hargrove could respond. "Multiple system failures caused by improperly decommissioned military hardware. The specific nature of that hardware can remain classified, but the fact that military modifications nearly brought down a civilian aircraft must be documented." "I agree," Hargrove said, surprising Alex. "This isn't just about national security anymore. It's about aviation safety. If other commercial aircraft receive the same incomplete decommissioning, they're flying with potential time bombs in their avionics bays." He turned to Alex. "Captain Morgan, your identification of the problem was exemplary. Your service record indicates you're currently on terminal leave before separation?" "Yes, sir," Alex confirmed. 12 years of service. "I'm transitioning to civilian aviation maintenance next month." "I'd like to request that you delay that transition," Hargrove said. "The Air Force needs someone with your expertise to help identify potentially compromised aircraft. This would be a temporary duty assignment, of course, but vital to national security and public safety." Alex hadn't expected this turn of events. For how long, sir? 6 months, possibly longer, with appropriate compensation and rank considerations, of course. Hargrove's expression softened slightly. Your actions today saved lives, Captain. We need that same expertise to prevent similar incidents. Before Alex could respond, the briefing room door opened. Commander James Reeves stood in the doorway, his uniform still damp from the rain. Behind him, a reluctant Lieutenant Colonel Harris hovered uncertainly. Excuse me, Colonel, Reeves said, addressing Hargrove. I apologize for the interruption, but I need to speak with Captain Morgan. Hargrove frowned. We're in the middle of a classified briefing, Commander. I understand, sir, but as a passenger directly involved in the incident, I believe my perspective may be relevant. Reeves stood his ground, the quiet confidence of a career SEAL evident in his bearing. After a moment's consideration, Hargrove nodded. Very well. 5 minutes. As the officers filed out to give them privacy, Reeves stepped forward. Harris remained by the door, clearly uncomfortable. Captain Morgan? Reeves began, his voice carrying none of the arrogance from earlier. I owe you an apology. My behavior on the aircraft was unacceptable and unprofessional. Alex studied him, noting the genuine regret in his expression. You were following a familiar script, Commander. I've heard it before. That doesn't make it right, Reeves replied. I made assumptions based on prejudice and insecurity. Worse, I used my rank and position to enforce those assumptions. He glanced back at Harris. We both did. Harris stepped forward reluctantly. I also apologize, Captain. Alex could see the difference between them. Reeves's remorse was genuine, a recognition of his own failure. Harris was simply following his superior's lead, as he always had. Your expertise saved our lives today, Reeves continued. But it shouldn't have taken a near-death experience for me to recognize your value. He extended his hand. I hope you can accept my apology. Alex considered the offered hand. Part of her wanted to reject it, to let him feel the same dismissal he'd so casually inflicted. But that wasn't who she was. Apology accepted, Commander, she said, shaking his hand firmly. Though I suggest you reconsider how you evaluate people in the future. Support personnel, as you call them, are often the difference between mission success and failure. Reeves nodded solemnly. A lesson I learned once before and shamefully forgot. It won't happen again. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a business card. I run a security consulting firm now. If you're ever looking for work, I could use someone with your analytical skills and technical expertise. Alex accepted the card with a nod. I'll keep that in mind. After Reeves and Harris departed, Colonel Hargrove and the others returned to continue the debriefing. For 3 more hours, they discussed the technical aspects of the incident, potential remediation strategies, and the scope of the investigation that would follow. By the time they finished, dawn was breaking over the Azores, pale light filtering through the coastal clouds. The storm had passed, leaving behind washed-out skies and the fresh, clean scent of rain-soaked earth. Alex stood at the base operations center window, watching as maintenance crews continued their examination of the aircraft. Reynolds joined her, offering a fresh cup of coffee. They'll be at that for days, he remarked. Every system will be inspected, every component tested. The aircraft won't fly again until they're certain it's completely safe. And the classified component, Alex asked. Being removed as we speak by a special Air Force technical team, Reynolds confirmed, along with a very thorough search for any other unauthorized modifications. Alex nodded, sipping her coffee. What happens now to the passengers, I mean? Another aircraft is being dispatched from London. They'll continue to New York tomorrow. Reynolds glanced at her. Including you if you wish, though Colonel Hargrove's offer might change your plans. Alex considered the offer she'd received. A 6-month assignment helping identify other potentially compromised aircraft. It wasn't what she'd planned for her transition to civilian life, but then nothing about the past 24 hours had been planned. I haven't decided yet, she admitted. It's important work, but you were ready to move on. Reynolds finished for her. I understand that feeling. After enough years of service, sometimes you need a different horizon. Exactly. Alex turned from the window to face him. Though I have to admit, being in that cockpit today, it felt right. Using my skills under pressure solving problems, that mattered. I've missed that since leaving the deployment rotation. Reynolds smiled knowingly. That's the thing about people like us, Morgan. We're built to function best when the stakes are highest. Peacetime has its challenges. My father felt that way too. Richard, Reynolds chuckled. Your father used to say he was never more alive than when everything was going to hell around him. He had a gift for staying calm in chaos, just like you. The comparison warmed her unexpectedly. All her life, Alex had measured herself against the father she barely remembered, a legendary pilot whose shadow seemed impossible to escape. Yet today she'd saved lives not by following his exact path, but by forging her own. I have something for you, Reynolds said, reaching into his flight bag. He withdrew a worn leather logbook. This belonged to your father, his flight logs from our time together. I've kept it all these years thinking I might find you someday. Alex accepted the logbook with trembling hands, running her fingers over the faded leather cover. Inside, page after page of her father's handwriting documented missions, aircraft conditions, weather patterns, the daily record of a pilot's life. Thank you, she whispered, emotion making her voice unsteady. This means more than I can say. There's something else, Reynolds continued, a letter he wrote to be delivered to you if anything happened to him. The squadron was supposed to pass it along, but with all the chaos after his death and your family moving, it ended up with me instead. He handed her a sealed envelope, yellowed with age but preserved inside a plastic sleeve. Her name was written on the front in a handwriting she recognized from birthday cards sent during deployments, her father's distinctive script. I haven't read it, Reynolds assured her. That's between you and him. Alex held the envelope carefully as if it might dissolve at her touch. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, Reynolds replied. Just know that your father would have been immensely proud of you today. Not because you followed in his footsteps, but because you blazed your own trail. He valued that kind of independence above all else. A knock at the door interrupted them. Colonel Hargrove entered, his expression serious but respectful. Captain Morgan, I need your decision regarding the temporary assignment we discussed. The investigation team is assembling, and we need to know if you'll be joining us. Alex looked down at the logbook and letter in her hands, then back up at Hargrove. Something had shifted inside her during the night, a recognition of purpose that had been missing in recent years. I'll accept the assignment, Colonel, she said firmly, on one condition. Hargrove raised an eyebrow, which is that the investigation is thorough and transparent. No covering up the fundamental issue to protect reputations or programs. The flying public deserves to know their aircraft are safe. Hargrove considered her for a moment, then nodded. Agreed. Report to Andrews Air Force Base next Monday. We'll have your orders and clearances prepared. He extended his hand. Welcome aboard, Captain. After Hargrove departed, Reynolds smiled. Looks like you've found your next mission. Apparently so, Alex agreed, though not what I expected when I boarded that flight yesterday. Life rarely gives us what we expect, Reynolds observed, just what we need if we're paying attention. Together they walked through the base toward the visiting officers' quarters, where Alex had been assigned temporary accommodation. The morning sun had burned away the last of the storm clouds, revealing a crystalline blue sky over the Atlantic. In the distance, the grounded Airbus gleamed white against the tarmac, surrounded by the organized activity of the investigation. Will you be returning to duty soon? Alex asked. Reynolds nodded. Once the initial investigation is complete, British Airways will want their senior captain back in rotation, though I expect there will be some additional questions about my decision to invite a passenger into the cockpit. An unorthodox decision, Alex acknowledged, but the right one, Reynolds countered. Sometimes the rulebook doesn't cover the situation at hand. That's when experience and instinct have to take over. He smiled slightly. Another lesson from your father. He was never one to let regulations interfere with the right course of action. They reached the officers' quarters, a utilitarian building with the unmistakable design of military architecture. Before they parted, Reynolds placed a hand on Alex's shoulder. If you ever want to hear more stories about Richard, or if you need anything at all, you have my number. Don't be a stranger. I won't, Alex promised, and thank you for everything. After Reynolds departed, Alex entered her assigned room, Spartan but comfortable with a narrow bed and desk typical of military accommodations worldwide. She placed her father's logbook and letter on the desk, but wasn't ready to open either yet. That moment required its own space and time. Instead, she showered and changed into the fresh uniform the base had provided. As she fastened the buttons, she caught her reflection in the mirror. The purple heart on her chest seemed to carry a different weight, now connected to a legacy she was only beginning to understand. A knock at her door revealed a young airman with a message. Her presence was requested at the aircraft for a technical consultation. The investigation was proceeding quickly. Outside, the morning had blossomed into a perfect Azorian day, the storms passing, leaving behind extraordinary clarity. As Alex approached the aircraft, she noticed a group gathered near the left wing. Among them stood Commander Reeves, engaged in what appeared to be a serious discussion with the technical team. When he saw her approach, Reeves broke away from the group and met her halfway. "Captain Morgan," he greeted her formally, "I hope you don't mind, but I've been sharing some observations with the investigation team. As a passenger seated near the wing, I had a particular vantage point." "Any information helps," Alex acknowledged. "What did you observe?" "Rhythmic vibration in the left engine nacelle beginning approximately 40 minutes into the flight, preceded by brief electrical fluctuations in the cabin entertainment systems." Reeves delivered his observations with the precision of a military report. "I dismissed these indicators initially, but in retrospect, they were exactly what you recognized immediately. Situational awareness is a practiced skill," Alex replied, neither accepting nor rejecting his implied self-criticism. Reeves nodded, understanding the subtlety of her response. "The technical team has located the classified hardware you identified. They're removing it now." He hesitated, then added, "I've also submitted a formal commendation for your actions to your chain of command. It's the least I can do." Before Alex could respond, Colonel Hargrove called her over to join the inspection team. For the next several hours, she worked with military and civilian technicians to document every aspect of the compromised systems. Her expertise proved invaluable in identifying how the military modifications had interacted with civilian components, creating the cascading failures that nearly brought down the aircraft. By late afternoon, the preliminary investigation had gathered enough evidence to confirm Alex's diagnosis completely. The classified counter-electronic warfare system had indeed been improperly decommissioned, remaining dormant until recent civilian software updates created conflicts that triggered its protective protocols. As the day's work concluded, Alex found herself standing alone beside the aircraft, running her hand along the smooth metal of the fuselage. In the fading light, she could see the subtle stress marks where the airframe had been pushed to its limits during the storm landing. "Quite a bird, isn't she?" Alex turned to find First Officer Jennifer Collins approaching. The younger woman looked tired but composed, the initial shock of the emergency having settled into professional determination. "She's a survivor," Alex agreed. "Good bones, solid engineering." Collins nodded. "Captain Reynolds told me you'll be joining the investigation team, looking for other aircraft that might have the same issue." "That's right." "Good," Collins said firmly. "What happened yesterday should never happen again. And I want you to know—" She hesitated, searching for the right words. "I was wrong to question your presence in the cockpit. You belong there more than any of us." Alex shook her head. "We all belong there. Different skills, different backgrounds, but working together. That's what saved the aircraft." "Still," Collins persisted, "what you did was extraordinary. And as a female pilot still dealing with occasional skepticism, I should have been the last person to question your capabilities." She extended her hand. "I won't make that mistake again." Alex accepted the handshake, recognizing the genuine respect behind it. We learn and grow. That's all any of us can do. Later that evening, alone in her quarters, Alex finally felt ready to open her father's letter. She sat at the small desk, the overhead light casting a warm glow on the yellowed envelope. With careful fingers, she broke the seal and withdrew a single sheet of paper covered in her father's distinctive handwriting. "My dearest Alexandra, if you're reading this, then I've taken my final flight. I'm writing this before a mission that intelligence suggests will be particularly challenging. It may come to nothing, most warnings do, but a pilot learns to prepare for all contingencies. You're only 5 years old as I write this, a beautiful, curious child who already shows the determination and intelligence that will serve you well in life. I wish I could see the woman you'll become, but if fate has other plans, know that I left this world thinking of you. I don't know what path you'll choose in life. Perhaps you'll follow me into the skies, or perhaps you'll find your own unique direction. Either way, remember this: true excellence isn't about rank or recognition. It's about mastering your chosen craft so completely that when the critical moment arrives, you can act with confidence. and precision. In my years of flying, I've learned that the most valuable people aren't always those with the highest rank or most visible positions. They're the ones who quietly perfect their skills, who understand systems deeply, who can be counted on when everything else fails. Be that person, Alexandra. Whatever you do, commit to knowing it thoroughly. The recognition may not always come, but the inner satisfaction of a job well done is a reward beyond price. Know that I love you without condition or reservation. And when you look up at the sky, remember that somewhere, somehow, I'm still flying. All my love, Dad. Alex read the letter 3 times, tears flowing freely down her cheeks. 30 years after it was written, her father's words had found her at precisely the moment she needed them most. After she had proven herself to be exactly the person he had hoped she would become. She carefully folded the letter and placed it back in its envelope. Then she opened the logbook, slowly turning pages filled with her father's observations about aircraft weather conditions and mission parameters. Occasionally, personal notes appeared in the margins. Observations about life flying and the world that offered glimpses into the man behind the pilot. In the back of the logbook, she found a photograph she'd never seen before. Her father standing beside his F-18 flight helmet under his arm, desert landscape stretching behind him. Beside him stood a younger Michael Reynolds, both men grinning with the easy confidence of elite pilots in their prime. Alex placed the photo on the desk beside her Purple Heart. 3 generations of service connected by more than blood, connected by a shared commitment to excellence that transcended time and circumstance. The next morning brought clear skies and the departure of most passengers on the replacement aircraft. Alex, now officially assigned to the investigation, remained behind with the technical teams. As she crossed the tarmac toward the maintenance hangar, she noticed a familiar figure standing near the perimeter fence. Lieutenant Colonel Harris stood alone, watching the activity around the aircraft with a pensive expression. When he saw Alex approaching, he straightened slightly, military bearing asserting itself. "Captain Morgan," he greeted her formally, "I understand you're staying with the investigation." "That's right," she confirmed, curious about his presence. "I thought you'd be on the replacement flight." Harris shook his head. "Commander Reeves is. I requested to stay an extra day." He hesitated, then continued with obvious difficulty. "I wanted to observe the technical inspection, to understand what actually happened up there." Alex studied him, noting a subtle change in his demeanor. Less arrogance, more uncertainty. "Why push me?" "Because I realize I know almost nothing about the systems I depend on," Harris admitted. "All these years in the Navy, and I've never bothered to understand how the machines around me actually work." He gestured toward the aircraft. "It took nearly dying in one to make me question that ignorance." It was an unexpected moment of self-awareness from a man who had seemed incapable of it just a day earlier. Alex recognized the difficulty of such admission, especially for someone whose identity was so wrapped up in his rank and position. "There's a technical briefing in 30 minutes, she said. "Not classified, basic overview of aircraft systems and what went wrong. You're welcome to attend." Harris looked surprised by the offer. "Thank you, I'd appreciate that." As they walked toward the hangar, Harris asked, "How did you learn to understand aircraft so completely? Was it natural aptitude or thousands of hours of study and hands-on experience?" Alex replied honestly. "Plus growing up around aircraft. My father was a fighter pilot. I wanted to understand his world." "Captain Richard Morgan," Harris said, earning a surprised look from Alex. "Commander Reeves told me. Said he was a legend in naval aviation circles." "He died when I was 5, Alex said. "Shot down during Desert Storm." Harris was quiet for a moment. "My father served in Vietnam, came home with 2 Purple Hearts and nightmares that never went away." He glanced at the decoration on Alex's uniform. "When I saw yours, I should have recognized what it meant. Instead, I dismissed it because it didn't fit my preconceptions." They reached the hangar doors. Inside, the technical team was preparing for the briefing, setting up displays showing aircraft schematics and failure analysis. "It's never too late to learn," Alex said, simply holding the door open. "That applies to aircraft systems and people." Harris nodded, understanding the dual meaning. "I'm beginning to see that." 6 months later, Alex stood in a briefing room at Andrews Air Force Base, presenting the findings of the investigation to a joint military-civilian aviation safety committee. Behind her, slides detailed the technical aspects of what had become known as the Cyber Shield incident. the discovery of improperly decommissioned military hardware on civilian aircraft. No. In total, our investigation identified 17 commercial aircraft with residual classified systems still installed. She explained, her voice carrying the quiet authority of expertise. All have now been properly decommissioned and returned to service. New protocols have been implemented to prevent similar oversights in the future. The audience included high-ranking officers from all service branches, FAA officials, and representatives from major airlines. Among them sat Captain Michael Reynolds, who had become a key advocate for the investigation. Thanks to Captain Morgan's identification of the specific electromagnetic signature associated with these systems, we were able to develop a non-invasive testing protocol that could be quickly deployed at major maintenance facilities worldwide. Reynolds added, no additional incidents have occurred, and we're confident the issue has been fully addressed. After the briefing concluded, Alex gathered her materials as the room gradually emptied. Her temporary assignment had been extended twice, ultimately stretching to a full year. During that time, she had earned a reputation as one of the military's foremost experts on avionics integration and system compatibility. Impressive presentation, Captain. Alex looked up to find Commander James Reeves approaching. He wore civilian clothes now, the tailored suit of a successful security consultant rather than his Navy uniform. Commander, she greeted him, I didn't expect to see you here. My firm has been contracted to review security protocols for several airlines, Reeves explained. And please, it's just James now. I retired from active duty last month. Congratulations, Alex said sincerely. How's civilian life treating you? Differently than I expected, Reeves admitted. But in a good way. I'm finding that my perspective has evolved since our flight together. Alex nodded, understanding what remained unspoken. Growth usually comes from unexpected places. Indeed it does. Reeves hesitated, then continued. My offer still stands, by the way. My company could use someone with your technical expertise and analytical skills. The salary would be substantially better than what the military pays. Alex smiled. I appreciate that, but I've actually accepted a different position. She handed him a business card. Starting next month, I'll be heading up a new aviation safety division at the FAA, focusing on integrated systems security. Reeves examined the card, genuine respect in his expression. They couldn't have made a better choice. He returned the card. Though if you ever change your mind, my door is always open. I'll remember that, Alex assured him. After Reeves departed, Reynolds approached, now wearing the 4 stripes of a senior airline captain, rather than his temporary Air Force uniform. Ready for dinner, he asked. Sarah's looking forward to finally meeting you. Over the past year, Reynolds had become something of a mentor to Alex and eventually a friend. His wife had extended numerous invitations to their home, eager to meet the daughter of her husband's long-lost wingman. Absolutely, Alex replied. Let me just grab my father's logbook. I thought Sarah might like to see it. Together, they walked through the corridors of Andrews, discussing the successful conclusion of the investigation and Alex's upcoming transition to the FAA. Outside, a perfect autumn afternoon painted the Virginia landscape in golds and reds, the air crisp with the promise of changing seasons. You know, Reynolds said as they reached the parking area, when I spotted your name on that passenger manifest a year ago, I never imagined where it would lead. Sometimes the most important journeys begin with the smallest moments, Alex replied. A name on a list, a purple heart on a lapel, a captain who looked beyond regulations to find the right person for the job. Reynolds smiled, unlocking his car. Your father used to say something similar. The difference between disaster and triumph is often just one person doing the right thing at the right moment. He was a wise man, Alex said. Yes, he was, Reynolds agreed, and he would be incredibly proud of the woman you've become. Not because you followed his path, but because you blazed your own with the same dedication and excellence. As they drove away from the base, Alex glanced out the window at an F-16 taking off its sleek form, climbing rapidly into the clear blue sky. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, from a humiliated passenger in economy class to a recognized expert leading critical safety initiatives. In her pocket, she carried her father's challenge coin, its weight a constant reminder of legacy and responsibility. Not a burden to bear, but a foundation to build upon. When the eagle called, she had answered, not as her father's daughter, but as her own woman. With her own skills, her own knowledge, her own courage, And in that answer, she had found not just purpose, but peace. Because in the end, when metal screamed and electronics failed and lives hung in the balance, there had been no question about who belonged in that cockpit. She'd earned her place there the same way she'd earned everything else, through simple willingness to know her job completely and do it without asking for recognition. That was the truest legacy any warrior could leave. Not fame or rank or decorations, but the quiet excellence that speaks for itself when the critical moment arrives. In that, father and daughter were one.